So let us start. So everyone, and those participating from the US, good evening, and or maybe to some, good afternoon. And for Japanese people, thank you very much for your participation very early hours on some Saturday morning. So we have participants from Japan, the United States, and all over the world. And then we are conducting this event co-hosted by the Elliott Global Studies of the George Washington, as well as the New Diplomacy Initiative. Thank you very much for your participation. So today, March 11th, 2011, 12 years ago today in Japan, we experienced a very large earthquake, a great Japan earthquake. Many lives were lost. Even after 12 years, Japan, in many parts of Japan, of course, including the Tohoku region where the earthquake were hit, and many memorial services are being held. And we'd like to also express our mourning to those who lost. And Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power accident occurred at the same time, and many people continue to have been impacted even now. And today we are discussing about the nuclear policy in Japan, and probably in the U.S. and other countries, nuclear power policy may have been greatly affected. And based on this fact of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power accident 12 years ago. So we are now talking about the Japan-US cooperation in the Fast Reactor development. About a year ago, on January 1st, the Yomiuri Shimbun, which has the largest circulation in Japan and actually in the world, ran this article which was about the Japanese participation in the United States plan for Fast Reactor. So the Monju's technical expertise will be shared with them and then to be utilized in the construction in Japan. And that and was about the TerraPower, which was built by Bill Gates of Microsoft, as well as the Department of Energy of the United States were planning on this development of fast reactor. And the TerraPower and the DOE would be financing 50% each. And to that, Japan's JAEA and the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries will be cooperating in terms of technology. And so that was the article which was run in the Yomiuri Shimbun. And according to that, this project will aim to start in 2028. So Japan and the United States regard this fast reactor as the next advanced reactor and be promoting the private and public partnership in development. The fast reactor and SDR efforts were made for commercialization in 1950s on, but as many experts pointed out, including those who are participating today, there is a problem of the very high cost and the question of the safety. In addition, a risk of proliferation. So, in the United States, in the 1990s, they stopped the construction of the prototype reactor. In Japan, in 2016, the government decided to abandon the Monju project, which have had many problems before that. However, a few years ago, the United States government once again began to focus on the development of fast reactor. And in Japan, as I said before, Japan also is cooperating in this United States plan in order to justify the nuclear fuel cycle, which has already been failed, in order to maintain the project of the Rokkasho reprocessing plant. And the US and Japanese government will try to cooperate in the export of advanced reactors. So in Japan and the United States, the governments are very proactively promoting this fast reactor. But as I said before, since even the 1950s, even in 2023, there is no fast reactor of SPR operating. So with this policy, is there any prospect for commercialization of fast reactors in the near future? The Monju has clearly failed in Japan. But what can we learn from that experience? And right now, the climate change is a pressing issue for all the countries in Japan. But are fast reactors an effective solution to climate change or to the problem of nuclear waste, which is also a big issue in Japan? The fast reactors will be an effective solution to that? And would that promote the proliferation at this moment where we have to be even more vocal about the need for non-proliferation? So in the next 2 hours, we will listen to the discussions of the experts from Japan and the United States. And thank you very much. That's it. So I am Sayo Saruta from New Diplomacy Initiative, one of the co-hosts of this event. I'm an attorney at law, and thank you very much for your participation. And
So we have 4 speakers who will speak for 15 minutes each. And the Sharon Scottle will be a moderator in the discussion part. First of all, first speaker, Mr. Frank von Hippel. He is the first speaker. And anyone who is interested in this field, he is known to everyone. He is the most famous expert in this field in the United States. And he is with the program on science and global security of Princeton University, and also the co-founder of the International Panel on Fissile Materials. And he's going to be the first speaker. Next speaker is Tony from Japan, Mr. Yuichi Kaito. For over 30 years, he was involved in the various nuclear power-related lawsuits, including the Monju litigation, Rokkasho, Hamaoka, and Oma. So a lot of experience with nuclear-related litigations. And he once served as the Secretary General of Japan Federation of Bar Association. Next speaker is Elsa McFarlane. So she is participating from Canada. She is professor and director, School of Public Policy and Global Affairs of Faculty of Arts and of University of British Columbia. She once was the chairman of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission from 2012 to 2014. That coincides with a time right after the Fukushima nuclear power accident. So I do recall that she presented very important questions related to that accident. She also served on the White House Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future. The last speaker is Ms. Eileen Nyoko-Smith, participating from Kyoto. She is Executive Director of Green Action Environmental NGO, and she co-founded the Stop the Monju campaign, and also last year and the 2 years before, she appeared on media many times. She is very well known from the book and the movie Minamata. So these are our 4 speakers, and the moderator is, and my name is Saruta Sayo from New Diplomacy Initiative, and then another moderator it is my honor to have Ms. Sharon Scorsoni, a research professor of the practice of international affairs at the Elliott School of George Washington University. She held senior positions at the State Department, Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and the Congressional Research Service before leaving government services to become a scholar at the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace. She led the Proliferation Prevention Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So these are our speakers and moderators. And the presentations going forward will be moderated by Sharon. So Sharon, you have the floor.
Thank you. This is such a pleasure and an honor for me. We're going to jump directly to our speakers. So I invite Dr. Von Hippel to begin speaking, and I know you have some slides, correct?
Yes. Would you put the slides up, please? No. And why the U.S. Department has begun again to promote sodium-cooled fast reactors and plutonium separation, and to explain why that initiative is doomed. Of course, this is in the context, in the Japanese context, where the Japan's nuclear energy research and development community would like to join in on this initiative because it has nothing else to do. And in fact, I think that's why the U.S. Nuclear community has been pushing this initiative, the research and development community, because it too has nothing else to do. Could I have the next slide, please? Next, yes, thank you. So this is a long story, which I will try to summarize briefly in my talk. And next slide, please. Three of us, I think we're all on this Zoom session. Myself from the United States, Masafumi Takubo from Japan, and Young-Min Kang from South Korea have written a book about the subject of how plutonium became a nightmare. It started as a dream and became a nightmare. Takubo and I have also proposed a global ban on the separation of plutonium. And you'll see that Takubo has translated our book into Japanese. The real use of plutonium is to make nuclear bombs. That's the only use which has been successful historically. It was plutonium that powered the Nagasaki bomb, and there's a miniature Nagasaki bomb serving as a trigger inside almost every one of the 10,000 nuclear bombs in the world today. Next, please. Sodium-cooled fast neutron reactors and reprocessing and plutonium recycle were originally proposed to save uranium in anticipation of its depletion due to the expected rapid growth of nuclear power. After the 1986 Chernobyl accident, however, nuclear power capacity plateaued, and commercial fast neutron reactors were not built. The original dream by advocates of nuclear energy nuclear power would quickly become the dominant source of energy for humanity. And it was thought that uranium was scarce and therefore plutonium breeder reactors were invented to turn the non-chain reacting uranium isotope U-238 that makes up more than 99% of natural uranium, to turn it into chain reacting plutonium and thereby obtain 100 times more energy out of a kilogram of natural uranium. But conventional water-cooled nuclear power plants turned out to be costly, and fast neutron sodium-cooled reactors were even more costly. So after an initial period of growth, the nuclear capacity stopped growing, as you see here. It plateaued at a relatively low level. This is global. Next slide, please. Also, there was another mistake that was made in projecting the growth of nuclear power. For 50 years, from 1920 to 1970 approximately, consumption of electric energy grew twice as fast as the economy. And the situation was the same in the United States, which is shown here, and the world. Somehow, electrical utilities assumed that this could continue, that electricity consumption could continue to grow twice as fast as the economy. Obviously, it could not. And around 1970, this rapid growth stopped. So when the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission projected how much electricity nuclear power would supply in 2020, its projection was 5 times higher than the total U.S. electricity consumption in 2020. And the U.S. nuclear power accounted for only 1/5 of that. So the projection was 25 times higher than reality. Next slide, please. So the cost of uranium did not increase. It has gone up and down depending on temporarily expectations that nuclear power would start growing again, but it hasn't gone up. And the contribution of the cost of uranium to the cost of nuclear power today is about 3% of the total cost of nuclear power. Most of the cost of nuclear power is the cost of the reactors. Next slide, please. Obviously, this did not make nuclear energy advocates happy. They have fought to convince their governments that new types of reactors would be less costly. And doing some of them have represented fast neutron reactors as advanced rather than the actual situation that they failed economically. In the United States, Republicans tend to love everything nuclear. Nuclear weapons as well as nuclear power. The Trump administration empowered the advocates of fast neutron reactors and put them in control of U.S. Nuclear power research and development. The Biden administration has let them continue because it wanted Republican support for its larger energy policy agenda, not because it believes that nuclear power will begin to grow again in the future. Next slide, please. Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, with a fortune of $100 billion, was persuaded to create a company, TerraPower, to commercialize fast neutron reactors, and is partnering with the Department of Energy and General Electric. General Electric was the designer of the Fukushima reactors, in building a demonstration sodium-cooled power reactor, they call natrium, the Latin name for sodium, in Wyoming. It is to be fueled with uranium, but TerraPower has been funded by the Department of Energy to do research on reprocessing and plutonium recycle. After the failure in Japan, after the failure of Monju and the cancellation of France's fast neutron reactor project, Japan's sodium-cooled reactor advocates have decided to try to partner with TerraPower. Next, please. But fast neutron reactors are cooled by liquid sodium, and as you will see here, liquid sodium reacts with air and water. And this is some crazy Americans demonstrating this by throwing half a kilo of sodium into a river. What you saw there was the reaction of sodium with water, freeing hydrogen, and then the hydrogen exploding, and each time the sodium struck the water. Next slide, please. Thank you. Well, because things leak, sodium leaks, and there have been many fires with sodium-cooled reactor prototypes. And despite 60 years of efforts and more than $100 billion, maybe $200 billion by now, in research and development, and the building of many prototypes, these reactors have not been commercialized. And the failure, the problems with sodium-cooled reactors are shown here with the four most advanced demonstration breeder reactors in the United States, United Kingdom, France, and Japan. And on the right-hand side, you see the capacity factor of each of these prototype reactors. The capacity factor is the average output of a nuclear reactor divided by its design output. And you see that compared to the global average for 400 water-cooled reactors, which is about 80% capacity factor, these prototypes did much more poorly. In Japan, of course, the Monju reactor, over its 23-year history, didn't generate enough electricity to really reach 1% capacity factor. But all over the world, the problem was the same, except in Russia. Next slide, please. In Russia, is much more tolerant of sodium fires. In Japan, one sodium fire was enough. But in Russia, they had in their oldest prototype sodium-cooled reactor, they had 14 fires in the first 14 years of its operation. Finally, they managed to stop the leaks, and since that time, that reactor and another newer reactor have had much better capacity factors than in other countries, but still somewhat less than the average water-cooled reactor. But Russia's breeder reactors are still not economically competitive with water-cooled reactors, and the construction decision on another prototype has been postponed until the 2030s. Now, there are two countries that are building prototypes today, China and India. But the primary purpose of these reactors appears to be to produce plutonium for weapons. Electricity will be a byproduct, and therefore their economics as power reactors may not matter. Recall that in the 1950s, the United States and Canada provided India with a reactor to produce plutonium for its breeder program and with reprocessing technology to separate the plutonium from the fuel. India used that plutonium to launch its nuclear weapons program in the 1970s. 15 years later, however, India has still not completed an operating breeder reactor. Next slide, please. The Cold War nuclear arms race and the breeder reactor programs have created a huge legacy of plutonium, enough for about 100,000 nuclear bombs. On the left here, I show how during the Cold War, in gray, primarily the United States and the Soviet Union separated out about 250 tons of plutonium for weapons. Since the end of the Cold War, many of those weapons that were built with that plutonium have been scrapped, but the plutonium still remains. Above that, you can see the plutonium, the civilian plutonium that was separated to provide startup fuel for the plutonium breeder reactors that were expected. And on the right, I show the four countries that had separated most of that plutonium. The United Kingdom has the largest stockpile. It finally stopped reprocessing in 2022, when the operator of its which is Electricité de France, the operator of its nuclear power reactors, refused to pay for more reprocessing. And then there's Russia, which does have one breeder using plutonium. The other one actually is fueled by uranium. And then there's Japan and France, neither of which has a breeder reactor program anymore, and therefore, but they do insist on continuing to separate plutonium, and that plutonium is used in water-cooled reactors from which it came. In France and Japan, about 10%, in France, about 10% of the fuel is mixed oxide fuel, which is a mixture of plutonium and uranium. But that fuel costs 10 times more than the cost of low-enriched uranium fuel that it displaces. So it makes no economic sense, and we have to look for other reasons to understand why Japan and France cannot acknowledge their mistake. So, next slide, please. So what can be done about this still growing stock of dangerous separated plutonium? Well, first, we have to educate the policymakers about the history so that the lives of the advocates for fast neutron reactors and reprocessing don't fool them. The proponents called sodium-cooled reactors advanced, not because their designs are new, but because the commercialization has failed. Outside, the government-supported nuclear energy research and development communities, there is no interest in using plutonium as a fuel. This activity continues only where governments insist that it continue and fund it. So we should end plutonium separation for any purpose. In the United States, we have a saying that when you are in a hole, stop digging. Next slide, please. We should place in nuclear weapon states, just as in Japan and other non-weapon states, we should place civilian and excess nuclear weapon plutonium under international safeguards. And Japan should join with the United States and the United Kingdom in organizing an international research program on options for disposing of existing stocks of plutonium. The United States did make an effort to turn its excess plutonium into fuel for water-cooled reactors, but that project became too costly, and the current plan is to dilute the plutonium and bury it in a deep salt bed. Proposals in the United Kingdom to use plutonium as a fuel have similarly been rejected by its nuclear utility. The UK has a research program on immobilizing the plutonium in a ceramic form and burying it. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Frank, so much. I think in light of the time, we will move through all 4 presentations, and then I may raise a few questions, and then we'll entertain questions from the audience. So I give the floor to you, Kaido-san.
Hello. I am Yuichi Kaido, and I'm an attorney at law, and I was in charge of the Monju litigation. And I'd like to explain in details why Monju project failed. I joined the anti-nuclear movement in 1978 when I was a university student and started working as a lawyer in 1981. And it was in 1981, this book was published by Dr. Jinzaburo Takagi, the danger of the plutonium, and in the chapter 5, he detailed about the fast breeder reactor. And it was in 1984, when I was 28 years old, that I was asked to work in the lawsuit on Monju. And the Ms. Miwako Ogiso was introduced to me by Mr. Junzaburo Takagi. Ms. Ogiso was working to stop the Monju. And so I have been involved in this project as an attorney for 32 years until the decommissioning in 2016. Japan experienced the Fukushima nuclear accident in 2011. This accident was caused by TIPCO and the national government's disregard for nuclear safety principle, and it has made it extremely difficult to return to normal civilian life in large areas of the country. Several industrial accidents of workers have been recognized in Fukushima, and there is a remarkably high incidence of thyroid cancer in children, about 300, but the government, power companies, and OnScare and others strongly deny any causal relationship to the accident. And this is the Monju reactor, which was built at Tsuruga City in Fukui Prefecture. Next. The danger of Monju stems from the use of fast neutrons, plutonium as a fuel, and liquid sodium, as you saw in the video by the presentation by Dr. Hippel, which reacts violently when it comes into contact with water or air as the coolant. The core is filled with a fuel containing as much as 18% plutonium, and unlike the case of light water reactors, the core is difficult to control and prone to power runaway accidents. Since sodium heats up and cools down easily, the wall thickness of the piping must be thin, and the piping it also has to withstand earthquakes. So the thermal stress and also the seismic capacity are in the trade-off. And if sodium leaks into the air, it burns violently, and if it reacts with water contained in concrete, it may it may cause the concrete to collapse, and steam generators. Heat is exchanged between sodium and water. If a heat transfer tube ruptures, high pressure water spurts into the sodium, causing it to react, and accidents are likely to occur that rupture. And when a heat transfer tube is ruptured, then that will cause the rupture of other four. But in the litigation, and we thought that logic was really flawed. And there is no emergency core cooling system in place in case of loss of coolant, and nor can water be applied from the outside, so it's not possible to take measures against severe accidents. So this is the process of the lawsuit. I don't have time to explain in details, but we won on the administrative litigation, which was delivered by Kanagawa branch of Nagoya High Court, but it was initially dismissed right after it was filed, and it took 9 years before the Supreme Court recognized the residents standing as plaintiffs. And 3 years after that, in December 1995, this sodium fire accident occurred, and this photo was taken by one of the media organizations, and you can see the sodium pouring down on the floor. Next. In the secondary cooling system, an accident occurred in which sodium leaked from a pipe. The direct cause of this accident was a design error in the thermometer, which broke which caused the grating on which the people walk. It was melted. So we wanted to actually see the site, so we made a request to the court, and then in January 1996, during the court inspection, we were also able to actually see the site. Next, please. And these photos, please take a very good look at. And these photos were show the damage to the floor liner discovered during the verification conducted by the court. So you saw in the previous slide the sodium was on the floor, but if you take out the plastic sheet, you saw this corrosion, but that was covered up by the plastic sheet actually. in the inspection, and the court goes there in order to investigate the facts, but the plastic sheet was covered this corrosion part. And you see the Tony Kimiko Fukutake, who wears a helmet with a red line, and beneath the plastic sheet, we found this corrosion, the damage. And in order to explore the cause of the damage, the Power Reactor and Nuclear Fuel Corporation, the PNC, conducted the reconstruction of the damage, and we also were able to see the actual reconstruction there. And as soon as we begin to see, you see nothing because the sodium would leak and everything becomes invisible. But after many hours, we found that the 5 large and small penetration holes were found, and there was sodium, and the concrete came into contact, and the sodium reacted violently with the moisture containing the concrete, and then a large amount of hydrogen was generated. So we were able to confirm that this phenomenon of this explosive reaction was occurring. So after all these inspection, and in the lawsuit, Mr. Kazuo Sato, the chairman of the Nuclear Safety Commission, and we summoned him as our witness, and the court recognized that. So the former commission chairman, Mr. Sato, said that based on the current state of knowledge, PNC would not be able to get a permit now for Monju. However, at Fukui District Court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs in both the administrative and civil suits. And the Nagoya High Court in 2003 ruled in favor of the residents, the first case ever in the nuclear-related litigations in Japan. And so it was a total victory judgment after 17 years after the lawsuit was filed. And then I'm there too, and to my left is the Ms. Fukutake, and then the Ogiso-san, and then with microphone is Mr. Sanshiro Kume. And in the appeal court, the decision in the Monju lawsuit was the first decision in the nuclear power lawsuit that squarely recognized plaintiffs' claims. The reasons were 3. The first is the oversight of molten salt type corrosion of sodium and iron. And the molten salt type corrosion is a very basic reaction which you can find in any chemistry textbook, but it was completely overlooked in the design and also the safety review. The second point is there was a flaw with the design in terms of the core damage accident. The PNC repeatedly done the computer calculations, but they didn't report the high numbers, but they only reported the very low numbers, which would clearly indicate the safety of the reactor would be maintained. And please take a look at this photo very well. So this is the confidential report of the PNC, and it says on the cover that this is limited for disclosure. And actually, I found this, and which was on sale in the one of the used bookstore in front of the University of Tokyo. So you will see the red stamp placed on the cover. Maybe this was in the some university in some lab, but actually that was sold to a used bookstore, and then this was sold at for 3,000 yen. And the steam generator in Monju even with the pressurized water reactor, the steam generator is a very vulnerable system. But in the case of fast breeder reactors, the heat exchanges between the steam and the sodium, and that involves a tremendous amount of risk. And in 1987, a high temperature rupture occurred in a fast breeder reactor in the UK, and a lot of tubes were ruptured in this accident. And actually, this accident was brought to our attention by an anonymous contributor to the newsletter of the Citizens Nuclear Information Center run by Dr. Takagi. And the Professor Keiji Kobayashi of Kyoto University, who was collaborating with us at that time, and he conducted the literature review from all over the world. And then he asked us to obtain this secret report that the PNC must have prepared. And my wife is actually a parliamentarian, Ms. for Fukushima, House of Councillors, member of the House of Councillors, and I asked her to try to get the information from the government. And her secretary at that time, Hideaki Takemura, actually obtained this information from the Science and Technology Agency. And actually, it was found that in 1981, the PNC actually had this information about the experiment that they conducted about this rupture. And the Supreme Court in 2005 on March held oral arguments. In May of that year, Supreme Court rendered an unjust decision reversing the High Court decision. And their logic was that at the time of licensing, that may have been overlooked, but on the basis of the fact that the measures were considered after the problems were discovered, so the safety review was no longer was okay. And although the problem was overlooked at the time of licensing, but they thought it was okay because the measures were taken after that. And so we requested a retrial because we thought the Supreme Court decision was unlawful, but after a half a year later, it was dismissed. But this decision of the Supreme Court at that time was repeated in the Fukushima nuclear plant accident case, actually. So whenever the government was pushed to the corners, they would they would take any measures in order to evade their responsibility. And the same ruling was actually handed down for the Kashiwazaki nuclear power plant. And the Monju only produced 15 days of electricity when it reached its full output in 1995. So the actual 0% operation, as was introduced by Dr. von Hippel, is quite right. And the construction, maintenance, and fuel costs until fiscal 2014 reached 1.3 trillion yen, excluding labor cost. Even during times not in operation, a total of 23.9 billion yen was budgeted annually, including 19.7 for safety measures, equipment, and so forth. So the PNC renamed now the Japan Atomic Energy Agency, conducted a core confirmation test at zero output from May to July 2010. So it was just before the 2011 Fukushima accident. But the invest machine was accidentally dropped into the reactor vessel. A horrible accident. But it was confirmed that the inspection was overdue for 9,000 equipment at Monju, so the Nuclear Regulation Authority issued a safety precaution order. And finally, in September 2016, the government decided to decommission Monju, citing rising costs. So the Monju was able to be stopped, thanks, of course, to the citizens' movement. But I'd like to mention three scientists And some of you may or may have known them personally, the Mr. Jinsaburo Takagi and Mr. Sanshiro Kume and Mr. Keiji Kobayashi. So they made tremendous contributions to this. Lastly, let me summarize my view about why Monju failed. The fundamental reason for the failure of Monju lies with the basic concept of plutonium core, cooling by sodium, and heat exchange between steam and sodium. So the technical concept itself was flawed, and also the in-vessel transfer system was dropped in the accident that I talked about. So the water is transparent, but sodium is opaque. So if something is dropped in sodium, it cannot even be pulled out. And as compared to water, sodium is high temperature. So in order to withstand the very high level of thermal stress, it has to be very rigid in terms of the structure. But it cannot be. So it's in a trade-off. So fundamentally, there is this technical difficulties, and because of these reasons, the dream nuclear reactor was indeed a short-lived dream. And right now, in Japan is said to be trying to participating in the U.S. Fast Reactor development. Pursuing a dream that never comes true may be allowed for individuals, but not for a national policy in which taxpayers' money is poured. And that's why I think this development of fast reactors should be definitely abandoned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kaido-san. That was fascinating. I would like to encourage everyone watching to share your questions in the chat. I know we're running a little long, but we're definitely going to have time for Q&A. So please think about it, type them into the chat. And now I am going to give the floor to Professor McFarland. Nice to see you.
Great. Good to see you. Good to see you all. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak. If you could pull up the slides, that would be great. And I will try to be as quick as I can. So I am going to basically focus on two issues. One is, are fast reactors going to be a solution to climate change? And then what about the nuclear waste produced by these reactors? So I'm going to start with the first. If you go to the next slide, why would we even entertain the idea of nuclear power to help with climate change, especially fast reactors? Well, we desperately need energy sources that do not produce carbon dioxide. And so nuclear power in general does not produce carbon dioxide. So then the question is, well, is this something that we could put together in the next few years? I don't know about in Japan, but in the United States, many of these advanced reactors are spoken about as if they already exist, but they do not. As Frank von Hippel has discussed, many of these reactors have been tried, but mostly failed. And so the natrium reactor that Frank von Hippel talked about, that Bill Gates is promoting, does not exist. It's still an idea, it's still a piece of paper, although they would like to build a prototype. Next slide. So how practical is this as a question? I would say it's rather impractical. And the biggest challenge for these reactors will be the economic costs associated with them. The capital costs associated with any new reactor build are very high. The proponents make claims that these reactors will be cheaper, but that's on the basis of very little actual data. So what do we know? Well, we know that the United States has attempted to build 2 reactors, only 2 now. They were going to be 4, but now just 2 remaining. The 2 remaining at Vogtle, Plant Vogtle in Georgia. The plants that were started to be built in the South Carolina plant on the right were abandoned over 5 years ago because the costs were escalating out of control. These plants were built with modules the modules were manufactured in factories. And the idea of a factory production is something that these new reactor proponents, the vendors, are saying is what will make the plants cheaper. But in the case of these plants in the United States, the factory production is what caused massive delays and massive cost overruns, because the factory kept producing the modules incorrectly for years. Next slide. So the welds of the modules were done incorrectly, not to nuclear quality scale at this plant in Lake Charles, Louisiana. This plant ended up with 3 different owners. The last owner was Westinghouse, a company you may be familiar with, and Westinghouse went bankrupt because of this plant and the fact that they could not get the welds right for years. And so this hasn't been a good solution to building these reactors, the factory production. So my observation of the vendors is that they haven't really been paying enough attention to this particular problem. Next slide. As I said, most of these reactors exist only on paper. There aren't demonstration models yet. And the way that any engineering project is done is that it's designed on paper or on computer these days. You build a small prototype. In building the small prototype, you find out what you did wrong in the paper model, and then you build a full-scale model, and again you will find that you got things wrong because scaling up is not a linear exercise. And so you'll redesign it again, and then you might finally be ready to deploy it. And so it takes many steps, and this is very costly when it comes to nuclear power. These projects tend to be called mega projects by those of us in academia because they are really large projects. Even if they're smaller reactors, so many pieces of the project have to come together to produce these reactors successfully. And so this project management becomes very important in the success or failure of these projects, of these reactors. Next slide. So there are other challenges, other costs that have not really been accounted for yet. In the United States, utility companies that produce electricity want energy technologies that can do load following now, because there are now there's growing amount of renewable electricity going onto the electric grid. Nuclear energy isn't such a load follower. These plants aren't plants where you can just flip a switch and it's operating at 100%. It often takes time to ramp up to 100% power. In part, these new designed plants can do load following by adding some kind of energy storage facility. Of course, this will add to the cost. Another cost issue is that most of these fast reactors plan to use a type of fuel called high-assay low-enriched uranium. This is different from the regular low-enriched uranium that's used by the reactors that are in operation in Japan and the United States. It requires both additional security, it requires safeguards, and the process itself will lead to more expensive fuel, so that's more costs. We'll talk about reprocessing. Frank's already talked about that in a bit, but if there is any reprocessing, that would add more costs. And I'll deal with some of these issues around waste in a minute. So next slide, please. Okay, so let's move to the waste discussion. And why should we be thinking about waste? Well, as I just said, in part there are cost implications to the waste. There may be security implications, physical security implications associated with the waste. There may be proliferation implications, in which case you need more safeguards measures. And there may be public acceptance issues with the waste. And if you are designing one of these plants, it's always good to think about these issues, the waste issues, the security issues, the safeguards issues, when you're designing the plant, not later on as an add-on. Next slide, please. So what are some of these nuclear waste issues? All reactors will have the used or spent nuclear fuel and how to store it and transport it. What to do with it? Does it need to be processed or reprocessed? How will you dispose of it permanently? What are the low and intermediate level wastes that are produced, and how will they be disposed, and how will all of this be done safely, securely, and with safeguards? And so in terms of fast reactors use what I would call chemically exotic fuels. So these are fuel types that we are not used to dealing with. They are different from the types of fuel in the existing reactors. Either they're metals, as opposed to oxides, or they have other aspects that make them different. In particular, for sodium-cooled fast reactors, the fuel itself has sodium in it to make it work with the sodium coolant, and this makes it difficult to manage. And so in the United States, all the fast reactor spent fuel has to be processed because it cannot be disposed of directly. In addition, many of these plants, because they've been scaled down, and I'll explain this more in a minute, use other equipment that becomes a waste stream. And then you'll have, if you have to process this spent fuel, you'll have additional waste streams from processing it. So it becomes a much bigger problem than the wastes that we have from regular light water reactors that we can, although Japan doesn't necessarily do this yet, but you can just dispose of them directly in a repository. Next slide, please. So what's different with these reactors, these sodium-cooled fast reactors? A number of them that are being proposed are small modular reactors, so they're smaller. This has direct implications for waste, because if you shrink the core, what happens is that you'll end up with more neutrons leaking from the core, okay? The smaller the reactor, the more neutrons will leak, and that will reduce the effectiveness of your reactor. And so what you need to do is you need to direct those neutrons back into the core, and you can do that with materials called reflectors. You can increase the enrichment of the fuel in uranium-235, and you can play around with other factors. But the bottom line is, because of the neutron leakage, you're going to be generating more spent fuel and more low and intermediate level waste than energy equivalent large pressurized water reactors. Next slide, please. So I think I talked through some of this already. You will need to deal with the sodium bonded uranium fuel. You'll need to process it. You'll need to deal with these additional materials, these reflectors and the shielding, and that will likely be low or intermediate level waste that you will have to dispose of somewhere. You will have to manage the sodium coolant itself. It becomes radioactive, and you have to decide how you are going to dispose of that. And by the way, sodium bonded fuels are not stable. They're pyrophoric, and so they need to be processed into a stable form. So what this all means is that you will have more waste streams, more facilities that need to be licensed and overseen, and then other supply chains. So next slide. And I'm not going to spend much time on this one. There are, of course, because of the materials that you're going to be using, more safeguards and security issues. So on to the last slide. So overall, will these reactors really have an impact on climate change over the next few decades? I would argue no, because you have high costs associated with these reactors, costs that we don't really know yet because nobody's really built even a prototype. You will have costs of fuel that will be higher than the costs of the fuel for regular light water reactors. You will have costs associated with waste that you don't have with regular light water reactors. It's not clear how long it would take to build these reactors, what supply chain issues you may encounter, whether you actually can put together the project management to actually build these reactors. And of course you have to license these reactors too. I would say you are looking at multiple decades before you're anywhere close to commercial, if you can ever compete in the electricity market 20, 30, 40 years from now. It will be a different market. We don't know. So that's my message, and I think I'm within time. So that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. You are perfectly on time, which leads us to our final speaker. But before we go to Eileen Smith, I'd just like to encourage people to write your questions. They can be in Japanese or English. We'll translate them both ways. But now I would like to give the floor to Eileen Smith. Thank you.
Okay, if I could have the slides. Okay, I'll be speaking on the current status of the Rokasha reprocessing plant and its implications for the Fast Reactor program. Next slide, please. So Rokasho reprocessing plant is located in Aomori Prefecture in northern Japan, and it faces the Pacific Ocean. The reprocessing capacity is 8 tons of plutonium a year, and the construction began in 1993, but it's been delayed 26 times. However, the project is now scheduled to be completed as soon as possible in the first half of fiscal 2024. So this means exactly a year from now. Next slide. However, in the meantime, Japan has accumulated 46 tons of plutonium already and has a commitment to reduce these stockpiles. So there's no present need for Rokasho startup right now. Next slide. So the original purpose of reprocessing a fast reactor program, this was already mentioned by Frank, that it was believed that uranium would run out, and Japan needed a domestically produced energy. Next. So the action taken was to start to work towards commercialization of the utilization of plutonium. And so the Fast Reactor program was begun, and in 1961, it was stated that realization would take place sometime after the latter half of the 1970s. But there were many, many failures, and it didn't go forward at all properly. So in 1997, it was announced that MOX fuel would be used in regular nuclear power plants. So this was the pluthermal program. And it was stated that by 2010, there'll be 16 to 18 Japanese nuclear power plants, reactors, that would be using MOX fuel. And the acquiring of plutonium was, of course, begun back in 1969. Reprocessing contracts began to be signed by UK and France for reprocessing spent fuel abroad. And the Rokasho reprocessing plant construction began in 1993, and the original completion date was 1997. Next slide. But what actually happened was uranium was found to be abundant. The Fast Reactor program was delayed to around 2050, and the word breeder sort of miraculously disappeared and became Fast Reactor program. This was in 2014. And the prototype reactor, Monju, as Mr. Kaido has pointed out, was decommissioned in 2016, completely shut down in 2017. And the pluthermal program has been dismal. It's been underperforming. So finally, in 2018, the revised roadmap was issued. This is the strategic roadmap of FR development. Next slide. But in the meantime, the government doubled down on imposing even stronger regimen of reprocessing of all spent fuel from nuclear power plants. And the unrealistic expectation of the nuclear fuel cycle program, as I mentioned earlier, it produced this tremendous amount of surplus, stockpile of plutonium, 48 tons peak in 2015. And so 3 years later, in 2018, the Japan Atomic Energy Commission declared surplus plutonium reduction policy. However, it did not spell out at all how this would be done. It was completely left unclear. Next slide. Now, during these 50 years, as already mentioned, some is renewable technology advanced rapidly, the costs went down, but nuclear power costs rose, and the climate issue became in the forefront. And so fast, cheap, reliable solutions are being needed by 2030. Next slide. So the industrial logic for fast reactors and reprocessing completely evaporates, and fast reactors will not yet be producing any significant quantity of electricity in Japan in 2050, if at all, and that's the carbon neutral goal that we have. Next. Now, so how much plutonium is to be consumed in Japan? Well, because Japan has this reprocessing of all spent nuclear fuel, its final repository plan is based completely on that premise. And now there's a lot of political pressure to finally get the final repository plan moving forward. So what does this mean? It means Japan must consume approximately 200 tons of plutonium. This is what already exists in the spent fuel that we've accumulated. And as Frank mentioned, back, in U.S.-Russia during the Cold War, total number of plutonium extracted is 250 tons. So you can understand what this 200 tons means. It's just an astounding amount. And even more plutonium must be consumed in the future. Next slide. So what's been Japan's capability of consuming plutonium? Over all these years, the Pluthomer program has only consumed about 5.3 tons of plutonium. And over these next 2 years, from 2023 to 2025 fiscal years, we're already planning, it's only planning to consume 0.7 tons of plutonium. This is at Takahama 3 and 4. Next. Now, operating the OMA full MOX reactor will be used to justify operating Rokkasho, but there are many obstacles. If operated at full capacity, OMA is designed to be loaded with approximately 1.7 tons of plutonium a year, but OMA is delayed. The original startup date was 2012. Current startup date is fiscal 2030. And there are 2 ongoing lawsuits, which Kaido-san can be speaking to you about. There are meetings on it all the time. Next slide, please. So what's the pressure for operating Rokkasho now? Why operate it? Well, the spent fuel pool at Rokkasho has been full since 2016. And so nuclear power plant sites have had no place to send the spent fuel. And some nuclear power plants will not be able to operate in the near future, and more plants will follow. This is in Kansai Electric, especially here now. So the logic is that Rokkasho must be operated to relieve the pressure on spent nuclear fuel storage at nuclear power plants. Next slide. So therefore, Japan's in a position of having to just right operating the first commercial reprocessing plant in a non-nuclear weapon state without any perceived use for the plutonium. Next slide. So an attractive fast reactor development research program is needed to justify Rokkasho. But how are Rokkasho and fast reactors related concretely? Well, Rokkasho is designed to extract plutonium for light water reactors, spent fuel only. And Japanese fast reactors the spent fuel will be reprocessed in another plant. It can't be reprocessed in Rokkasho. And that plant is, of course, completely unplanned for yet. Next slide. However, the fast reactor development helps to justify the continuation of the nuclear fuel cycle program in Japan, and that's why Japan needs it in order to justify Rokkasho operating. Next slide, please. So this is Japan's fast reactor development policy. It was stated in 2016, and it reaffirmed the commitment to the nuclear fuel cycle program. And in 2018, the strategic roadmap of FR development was issued. You can see these 3 steps here, and it was stated that the timing for full-scale use of fast reactors is expected to be sometime in the second half of the 21st century. And then 4 years later, the Fast Reactor Strategic Workshop issued its report and stated that its sodium-cooled fast reactors were evaluated as the most promising. Next slide, please. So the revised strategic roadmap of FR development was issued last December, and the work plan is as follows. You can see it here, and we're right now at approaching fiscal year 2024, 2028. And at the bottom, you can see that the plan is around fiscal year 2028. The basic design of demonstration reactor and decision to move to licensing procedures is to go ahead. This is the plan. Next slide, please. So here, enter the U.S.-Japan affirming its commitment to nuclear energy cooperation. And to the left here, you see the U.S. Energy Secretary, and to the right, METI Minister. And they stated that this was all necessary for global security and clean energy transitions. So this was January, just 3 months ago. Next slide, please. So what U.S.-Japan cooperation does is U.S. cooperation helps to justify Rokasho. It helps Japan continue in this path, and it buys time for Japan. And what will result in is that it will lead Japan further into the quagmire of plutonium. And does the U.S. really want to do this? Next. So this is the Natrium project, and it's already been spoken about by earlier speakers. And note that Natrium uses uranium and not plutonium, and there's no reprocessing. Next step. Next slide, please. But it's worthy to note that Japan's Fast Reactor program will use plutonium and will reprocess. So why Natrium project? Well, Monju failed, and then Japan clung on to Astrid, the French project, which shut down, and now it's embraced VTR and the Natrium project. Next slide. So U.S.-Japan cooperation helps keep plutonium and reprocessing alive, and the Idaho National Laboratory is pro-plutonium, pro-reprocessing. So this undermines the non-proliferation efforts of the U.S. from the Ford, Carter, to Obama administrations, and it helps Japan double down on plutonium use, and it weakens non-proliferation policies, which are already in bad straits. Next slide, please. So what should happen, as Frank and everybody has spoken about, and we can talk about this in the discussion because it's really important, is that Japan needs to declare into reprocessing and nuclear fuel cycle program, change to once through nuclear spent fuel policy. And these negotiations need to take place and get a general international agreement on plutonium storage and plutonium disposal. And so why doesn't this happen? And how to make it happen is the issue now. Next slide, please. So it's important. You can see over these last three speakers, and I think with seeing what the Japanese situation is now, that this whole thing is nonsense. And what we need to do is make that visible and critique the U.S.-Japan Fast Reactor cooperation, show how it's meaningless, show how it leads to nuclear proliferation, show how there's serious safety concerns. And this is the exact thing that we need to be doing now. Thank you very much. And if you go to the last slide, it's a URL that introduces the Japanese audience to all this information.
Yeah, I think we should welcome applause. Thank you so much. I have followed these issues myself for at least 15 years, maybe 20 years. I have never heard more cogent arguments, well put on every single score, which almost leaves me speechless for questions, because after the four of you have laid out very, very clearly the facts, I'm scratching my head thinking, why would we ever want to do this? I can't, besides bureaucratic politics models where vested interests within either the scientific community or the government, it truly makes very, very little sense. So, but while we're waiting for some questions from the audience, and I know there are, we have a rather large audience, but we also have some true experts in this. I thought I would just mention a few things that that I take away from your presentations and maybe tease out a little more detail. Kaito-san, the information that you had about the reactions with the sodium and the concrete, I've been to Monju, I've seen their demonstrations of how harmless sodium fires are within contained environments, but that struck me as a really, really important point, as well as, Allison, your point about these smaller reactors having more neutron leakage. So I wonder, Kaito-san, could you talk a little bit about more like what, is there anything that needs to be further done in terms of regulation, or could I'd just like to ask you to elaborate a little more.
Yes. During the lawsuit on Monju, important information was concealed. And as I said in my presentation, what is important is that the important thing, we dug that up on our own. That's something that I wanted to emphasize in my presentation. The technology with plutonium is concealed more than the general technology related to nuclear power, because it is related to the question of security, so they want to conceal it. And in Japan, while the Monju was being litigated, there was no law on the concealment of the important information by the government. Now we have such a law in place. So the information doesn't come out with regard to plutonium. So we are placed in a very difficult situation in that regard. So in that sense, and also once the information is concealed, the government can say anything in order to conceal that, continue to conceal that. So I don't know if this can answer your question, but it's important that we make the government disclose all the technological information related to this. That's very important.
I'm also struck, the U.S. and Japan are, countries where the rule of law are relatively respected. That is not the case for some other countries, right, which may actually conceal even more information. One of the things that concerns me, and you touched upon this, well, all of you touched upon this, is the plan to export small modular reactors around the world, especially because electricity demand, well, not just for climate change, but electricity demand in many lesser developed countries is expected to grow exponentially. And I take your point, Frank. I loved your data about how, the estimates of both electricity demand and, growth of nuclear power have been consistently, I don't want to say exaggerated, but overestimated, not just in the U.S., but by the International Atomic Energy and the International Energy Agency. But it seems to me, given some of the issues that you raised, Allison, with the fact that these small modular reactors are really at this point paper reactors, and even the U.S. experience with some manufacturing has been, I guess woeful could be one word to describe it. Is this actually going to happen? And if we tried to make it happen, I could foresee some significant issues moving forward. If you could just comment a little on that, and then we'll move. I know we have some Japanese questions in our lineup.
It's a good question. I don't know. Governments are, and not just the U.S. and the Japanese government, but the Canadian government, other governments are putting some money into this. It may sound like a lot of money to citizens, hundreds of millions of U.S. dollars or even $1 billion U.S. dollars, but to get something like a sodium-cooled fast reactor commercialized, because you need new kinds of fuel, you need enrichment facilities that don't exist right now. It's a very heavy lift, and it will take tens to hundreds of billions of dollars to pull off, to get to commercialization. And the private sector doesn't have that kind of money. So that's going to have to come from governments. And so when governments see the actual real price tag and the fact that you have to invest this money and it's going to take decades before you get there, I don't know that anybody's going to have the patience to do that. But at the moment, at least on the development side in the U.S., I think these reactors can make investors money when they go public with them. So they don't actually have to have a reactor to make money.
The only thing I can say is, oh my. It's even more nonsensical. Sayo, I know there are some Japanese questions that you want to put forward, or from our Japanese participants.
Yes, thank you very much for your questions. And you talked about the nonsensical, but there are some questions related to that. So we can understand this is nonsense. However, who is getting profits from continuing with the reprocessing initiative? And another person also talked about this nonsense, but technically and scientifically it's failed. This fast reactor development is now going on. Why is that? And what is the source of their motivation, in your view? So So what is the motivation with those people who are promoting this on reprocessing side and also this fast reactor, whether it's maybe Dr. von Hippel and then followed by Kaito-san, probably?
Yes, in different countries there's a different explanation, I think. In France, I think it's a situation in which a portion of France has become dependent on the jobs provided by France's huge reprocessing plant. It's owned by the government because it's not economic, and the government also owns the nuclear utility in France, and forces it to pay for reprocessing, even though that utility has demonstrated in the United Kingdom then that when it's allowed to choose not to reprocess, it will choose not to reprocess. I think the situation is similar in Japan. In 1993, I met with the fuel cycle managers of Japan's biggest nuclear utilities, and I asked them whether they would choose again to reprocess if they had the choice. And they said no, but we're trapped. The Japanese government has trapped them by requiring that they reprocess their spent fuel, by not allowing them to plan on burying the spent fuel in a future repository. So, in other countries, the connection goes back to the nuclear weapons programs. That in Russia, for example, Russia's government-owned nuclear company does both nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, and therefore it has a very strong connection and access to the government's treasury. So it is a mystery. Why does this go on? It defies gravity, if you like, economic gravity. And ultimately, governments have the public money, and they can, and sometimes, if the public allows, they spend it on stupid things.
Thank you very much. In case of Japan, Kaito-san or the Eileen, would you like to talk about the Japan situation? So may I? It's a very difficult question to answer, but stopping reprocessing, and once the METI was close to make that decision about 20 years ago, but that was squashed. And then the nuclear fuel cycle, and also the pursuing the reprocessing policy were confirmed, and those people who decided on that are still holding the power in Japan. And when the Democratic Party government was here, then they tried to overturn that, but they couldn't, and now it's back on the previous policy. Probably they may not have the intention to have nuclear weapons, but I think they just want to avoid the situation where the Japan cannot be nuclear arms. So Japan having a potential desire to be a nuclear weapon country. So at the very bottom of the psychology of the Japanese government and the power that be, there is that desire, I think, to once hold the nuclear power. So Eileen, would you like to answer your question? Eileen, you are muted. You're still muted. You're still muted, Eileen. Eileen, you are muted. I'm so sorry. So as Kaito-san said, and I completely agree, another major thing is that this project, this plan, and this project, it's just postponing the waste issue down the road forever. So for many years, Japan was able to send the spent fuels to overseas, and there is a long gap between the time the fuel is sent overseas and the fuel coming back to Japan. But then now we are in a situation where this cannot be done. So the reprocessing can be postponed in this. Sharon, can I pose another question in Japanese? So I will continue. And this is a reporter from NHK. NHK is sort of like a CNN in the US. And this is a question to the speakers from the US. So there has been a lot of moves towards decarbonization, and Ukrainian crisis being used as an excuse for reevaluating the nuclear power. So some people in Japan says that there will be some competition once again for uranium, or already such a competition already has begun, according to them. So the Dr. von Hippel told us about this uranium prices development. The reprocessing program started because of the supposed fear of depletion of uranium, but now it turned out to be that the uranium is abundant. But then if the competition becomes more fierce over uranium, then the reprocessing program may be reignited. So the question is about your view about your outlook for this, about the competition over uranium and therefore the reignition of reprocessing. Allison and von Hippel. So
yes, I don't. The amount of uranium requirement globally depends on the nuclear capacity globally, and that has not been increasing. And it is true that China has been increasing its nuclear capacity, but other countries in the world have been retiring nuclear power plants faster than they're building them, and therefore that's the reason that the total global capacity is constant. There is every 2 years that there's the IAEA and the International Nuclear Energy Agency put out a report on the availability of uranium. And their most recent report was that there is enough low-cost uranium for nuclear power at the current level for 100 years. Now there are, as with other things, there are dislocations as a result of the war in Ukraine. People, don't want to buy uranium from Russia if they can, and Kazakhstan, which is the world's biggest uranium exporter, may have to find new ways to export its uranium. So that there is some disruption, but this is not an indication of a long-term issue. Even if the price of uranium doubled, it's still a tiny fraction of the cost of nuclear power.
Yeah, I would agree with Frank completely. Speaking as a geologist, which is what my training is, it turns out that for most minerals, resources that we need, the more we look, the more we find. And as folks in Japan well know, because you've spearheaded this work, uranium even exists in seawater, in the ocean. And if you need it, you can extract it. As well, remember that you won't need much uranium for new plants for many decades. In the meantime, many of the existing plants will continue to shut down. So there really won't be a real need, even if some folks' wildest dreams of a nuclear future are envisioned. It's really over 100 years off. And frankly, we have much more pressing problems to worry about right now than whether there's going to be enough uranium 100 years from now.
Thank you very much. So let me continue to introduce more questions in Japanese. So this is a question to Kaito-san. So what is the present state about the lawsuit on Rokkasho reprocessing plant? You talked about the Monju, but briefly, can you describe about the present state of the Rokkasho litigation? Yes, about the Rokkasho reprocessing litigation. Still before the Aomori District Court, about 30 years now. But the first instance ruling has not been delivered yet. But why is it so? And about this reactor, as Eileen explained before, because it's not completed at all, and up until a little bit before, because the state government could not even make the responses to the new requests for changes, and the government was not able to answer any questions posed by the court. That is why this litigation has been stalled for years. But basically, they cannot answer any questions about the safety, but the court has this attitude of, okay, we're going to wait for you to be ready to answer those questions. But this situation is right now changing rapidly because the permit for changes will be made, but now we are seeing some answers are now beginning to come from the state government, but now we are in the process of preparing our answers for our rebuttal to those questions. And so 30 years have been going on, but right now we are still in the process of now entering into the fully fledged deliberation over normal litigation. There is another litigation, and the plaintiffs are from the religious communities and filed with the Tokyo District Court. That deliberation has started. And then that litigation was filed in the more recent situation. So the speed with which the deliberations are taking place are about the same as with our litigation. But we believe that there is a possibility that we can actually win. Thank you very much. So the Mr. Tatsuhiro Suzuki participating in it, and he wrote his questions in English. So Sharon, can you introduce his questions?
I feel silly introducing Tatsu's question. He should do it himself here, but his question was about something positive that the U.S. and Japan could do together, specifically on research and development into plutonium disposition. So one of the important things is, if you're not going to reprocess, what do you do with the plutonium? So he was wondering, I guess a question for Frank and or Allison, has there been any encouragement from the U.S. government to include, what's the status of the research and development, and has there been encouragement to Japan to cooperate?
Shall I respond? Of course, the easiest way to deal with plutonium is to leave it in the spent fuel to start with. That's the least costly way to store it, and it's also the least costly way to dispose of it, just with the spent fuel when a repository becomes available. And so I think it's important to challenge the Japan's government on this point, that they have to allow Japan's utilities to bury the spent fuel unreprocessed with the plutonium contained in it if they're going to deal with the plutonium problem. Otherwise, it'll just accumulate. And in fact, I think that's if Japan abides by its commitment not to increase the amount of separated plutonium, then they cannot operate the Rokasho reprocessing plant at any higher than a very small capacity, or hardly at all, because of course Japan doesn't have a plant, a fuel fabrication plant. It's a long way from completion for fabricating the plutonium the Rokasho reprocessing plant separates. So in the United States, and I do agree that there should be a collaboration between the U.S., Japan, and the UK on plutonium disposal. It is in a way, it's very simple. You just dilute the plutonium and you bury it. So it's not high tech, and of course that makes it unattractive to research and development people. Thank you.
We need a high tech, super expensive way to do this. Allison, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it's a great idea from Tatsu to work positively together on such an issue, because it is an issue. There's all these stockpiles, as Frank has shown us, of civilian separated plutonium, and really folks don't have a clue as to how to direct their policy to manage this material, and it does need managing, because as the United States is showing everybody, institutions aren't necessarily forever. So I think it's good to put it underground in some way, shape, or form, and so it's figuring out what that is. Now, if you want to spend more money, Frank and I wrote a paper quite a few years ago now, saying that one way to sort of use your MOX fuel fabrication facility to good ends is to make a low-quality MOX with your plutonium that you can then just throw away. It would not be of the quality that you could use in a reactor, but you'd be using the facility that you sunk money into just to make a waste form. And it would be a very decent waste form, and then you just put it in the ground. So
that is creativity at its best. I really like that idea. We have actually run out of time, but I did want to, so I'm actually going to forego my closing remarks, except to say that this is the best panel I have ever had the pleasure of co-hosting. I really appreciate it. I wish we had time for all of you to give, some closing remarks. But I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to thank the New Diplomacy Initiative for such an excellent job in setting this up and implementing it. and then I would like to pass it back to Dr. Saruta in case you have any final remarks.
Yes, indeed. I think we have had a wonderful 2 hours and we learned many things and also very easy to understand. We hope that we can have another opportunity like this so that we can cooperate between Japan and the US so that we can change the society. So this was co-hosted with the George Washington University and it was an honor. And we'd like to have another chance like this so that we can work together with George Washington University. And then in the chat, we also put up some information about the new diplomacy initiative. And then, I'm sorry, this is all in Japanese, but we are sending out this questionnaire, and please fill in the questionnaire, and please give us the feedback about the kinds of topics that you would like to have us organize around. So, again, thank you for a very wonderful 2 hours, and please give all of them, the presenters and the moderator, Sharon, a big round of applause from everyone. So with this, I would like to close this symposium. Thank you indeed.